This section is all about setting effective lesson objectives and lesson outcomes. We're going to start off with looking at why setting these are so important and vital. We're going to move on to how to set them, how to write them, how to formulate them. And finally, we're going to look at how to differentiate lesson outcomes for students. So let's start off with why lesson objectives and lesson outcomes are so crucial to student attainment and progress. The first thing to consider here is they tie in with assessment for learning, or they should do. And if you don't know what assessment for learning is, very simply, it's where a student's at, it's where a student needs to get to, and it's how they're going to get there. And at any point in the lesson, you as a teacher should know that, but also the student in particular should know that too. And lesson objectives and outcomes form an integral part of the process because a student needs to use the objective and the outcomes to measure their own progress within a lesson, but also in between lessons, over a series of lessons or a cycle of lessons. The second reason they're so important is for motivation. A student needs to know what they're trying to achieve and how they're going to achieve it and how they're going to know what success looks like. Because if they know they've succeeded in something, if they know they've met a particular lesson outcome, then they're going to move into the next lesson with renewed confidence and belief, and they're going to know that they're learning and achieving. If there are no objectives and outcomes, they're going to be left very much in the dark, and the lesson isn't going to be half as effective if that structure is not in place. So what are lesson objectives and lesson outcomes? A lesson objective is what students will learn in that given lesson. A lesson outcome is what students will be able to do by the end of that lesson. And there is obviously a distinct difference between the two. Okay? A lesson outcome will more likely be written in the future tense. So you will be able to do this. Okay? Would be a lesson outcome. So let's start with setting an effective lesson objective. And actually, I'm going to ask you, watching this in a minute, to think of a lesson that you've got coming up and ask you to actually set your own objective for that lesson based on what we're going to talk about next. So let's say, for example, I'm a history teacher and I'm sat here and I'm about to plan a lesson on Hitler's rise to power in Germany. There is a code of practice for setting an effective lesson objective. Let's have a look at that now. It's called SMART, and the letters stand for different things. So specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time appropriate. We need to remember each one of those factors whenever we set lesson objectives or a lesson objective within itself. What we mean by specific is to ensure that our objective is as focused as possible and not wishy-washy and too broad. It needs to be measurable, so it needs to feed into the outcomes. It needs to allow for you to create and write really good lesson outcomes. It all is underpinned by the lesson objective. It needs to be attainable, so in other words, it can't be too hard, it can't be too easy. It needs to be realistic, and what we're talking about there is particularly when it comes to the students you're teaching in your class. You know your class better than anybody, so make sure that that lesson objective is realistic for them as a body of students. And finally, time appropriate. Is this objective going to apply to one lesson or a series of lessons, and so on? So with that in mind, you hopefully you can pause this lecture at this point and just think to yourself, right, I've got a lesson coming up, can I actually formulate an objective? Okay, so hopefully you've come up with your own lesson objective relevant to your subject area. This is one that I came up with earlier for the lesson on Hitler's rise to power. To understand the reasons for Hitler's rise to power in Germany in the years 1919 to 1933, or to learn the reasons for Hitler's rise to power in Germany in the years 1919 to 1933. Is it specific? Is it focused? Well, I've put the years in there. I've tried to make it as specific as possible. Is it measurable? We'll come on to that in a minute. Is it attainable? Is it realistic? Is it time appropriate? And they're the things that I've tried to think about when I've formulated that objective for one 60-minute lesson. Okay, so it's one objective that I've got. I mean, you can have several. You can have 2 or 3. But let's have a look at the outcomes now that I've come up with to go along with this objective. And it might be that you want to have a look now at your objective and think, well, what outcomes am I thinking are going to go with the objective that I've come up with? But the ones that I've come up with are: all students will be able to describe some of the events that led to Hitler being appointed Chancellor in 1933. So I'm starting off with all. The second one is: most students will be able to describe and explain the significance of the key events that led to Hitler's appointment as Chancellor. Most students will be able to compare and contrast the different reasons before coming to a judgment on the most important. And finally, some students will be able to demonstrate an expert knowledge and understanding of the key events. They will be able to effectively evaluate the relative significance of each factor and communicate their thoughts and opinions in a short essay. Now, they are staggered differentiated outcomes. You don't have to differentiate the outcomes. You can just literally have a list of bullet pointed outcomes that everybody is aspiring towards. But I think having the differentiated outcomes gives you, a teacher, a really nice measuring tool, but it also helps the students to be able to relate their own target grades or their own actionable targets that they have with what the outcomes for that lesson actually are. So that's the pros really of going down the differentiated route with the outcomes. And again, I could have said, instead of using the all, most, some model, I could have had A grade students will be able to, B grade students will be able to, C grade students will be able to. So I could have differentiated it in a different way with regards to those outcomes. Now, the language that you use as you go through those outcomes, I would refer to Bloom's taxonomy. So I would refer to higher level skills being built in the more advanced you get within those outcomes. So at expert level, there should be higher order skills that the students have to access or have to use to actually be able to achieve that level or to achieve that outcome. So evaluation, coming to a judgment, looking at the significance of factors, higher level analytical skills rather than your very straightforward describe, which might fall perhaps on the all station. Everybody should be able to describe the factors, but as you move up, it gets more challenging. So that's an objective, that's an outcome, that's how to set an objective, that's how to set effective outcomes. What I would suggest you do now is have a go yourself at trying to set a set of outcomes for your objective.